Hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel where I discuss music and albums and songs, etc, etc. And today I'm doing another album review. But wait, this isn't a new album? Yep, that's right. I've been teasing this a little bit when I've said that I have more individual album reviews on the way, some of which might be a bit different from what I usually do. And this is something that I have not done since my blogging days on my website, most of which I look at now and cringe an unimaginable amount. For the first time since I started this YouTube channel nearly a year and a half ago, I'm doing a throwback review. The album I'm discussing today is one that came out right near the beginning of this current decade, released in June of 2020, the sophomore studio album by American singer-songwriter Phoebe Bridgers, Punisher. Now, the first question you're probably asking is, why this album? And to be honest, there's not one big specific reason why this of all albums was the one that I decided to make a throwback review of. Rather, there were a bunch of smaller reasons, one of which being that of all the albums I could choose, I'd have to pick something if I wanted to do a throwback review, and I just did not want to overthink it too much. And I also didn't want to do something too cliche like reviewing OK Computer or To Pimp a Butterfly or Abbey Road or any of a number of albums that might be among the most obvious to wonder what I might think about them, which could be a good question for a lot of classic albums considering how controversial my opinions can be sometimes. And on a side note, after I wrote that in my script, I actually remembered that I did an April Fool's review of OK Computer on my blog in 2023, but that doesn't count. So anyway, if you're wondering why I chose Punisher, beyond everything I just said about not wanting to be too cliche, well, for one, it is a very well-known and well-respected and acclaimed album, not too much to the point where it feels like the most obvious choice, but enough that this might intrigue more viewers than some random obscure album almost no one's ever heard of. I mean, this is very much a music critic 2020s classic, you could say, and it's bound to make a lot of people's decade and best albums lists, I'd have to imagine. Another reason is that it's an album I've been familiar with since the early part of this decade, which was around the time I started getting into listening to full albums, and thus it's kind of interesting for me to look back at this years later with way more music listening experience and a much more evolved taste in music than I had at the time, when I felt like I needed to praise this just because it was what the critics adored and it seemed like a cool album to like, without even caring about what was actually on the album. But thirdly, this is still Phoebe Bridgers' most recent solo album to date. I'm not sure when we're getting another solo album from her, it may or may not be anytime soon. But now whenever that happens, I'll have the context of having a review of this album on my channel before reviewing her next album. So on that note, why not start by talking about her 2017 debut album Stranger in the Alps? Well, I had listened to it a few times a while ago, but to refresh my memory, I gave it another listen in preparation for this video, and I honestly think it's just okay. I can respect the detailed storytelling and some clever writing and the way it pieces together different aspects of the stories being told, and Phoebe Bridgers is a very capable singer, but sonically there just wasn't a whole lot going for that album, where the vibes and atmosphere were there, but I felt emotionally distant from it, because the songs mostly didn't come together into powerful emotional statements, at least the way I heard it, even though I can acknowledge that Funeral is a pretty damn great song. But the other big reason why I chose this album is because it's an album that both fails and succeeds in interesting and fascinating ways, where some of the problems I have with it are then solved in ways that actually just end up not being a solution at all, even though a lot of aspects of it make total sense on paper. It's just that the execution isn't always there, leaving me feeling like Punisher is a pretty good record, but not a great one, and while there are some absolutely excellent moments, I do feel a bit underwhelmed by it as a whole. So let's start by talking about the main characteristics of this album, and I'll begin with the lyrics. And credit where it's due, Phoebe Bridgers can be quite good at making specific references and unique lines that are about the furthest thing from cliché. That's not to say there aren't any cliches on this album, but they don't feel too basic because of what they're surrounded by. On Garden Song, she says, "The doctor put her hands on my liver. She told me my resentment's getting smaller." And that was literally talking about something that actually happened, not a metaphor. And those kinds of lines, whether literal or metaphorical, appear quite often on this album, a big example being the song Kyoto, even though that's an example where I don't always think it works, like the payphone line, or "I'm gonna kill you if you don't beat me to it." There's a lot of clever lines in that sort of writing style, though, like how she opens Halloween with, "I hate living by the hospital, the sirens go all night. I used to joke that if they woke you up, somebody better be dying." Or more sharply devastating on the following track, Chinese Satellite, with lines like, "Why would somebody do this on purpose when they could do something else?" Honestly, that's one of the most devastating songs on this album, which brings us to the more emotional side of this project beyond the humor and blunt kookiness of it. And yeah, there are some real emotional gut punches, or at least a lot of attempts at it. The back-to-back of Moonsong and Savior Complex is a good example, with the devastating lyrics about feeling dependent on someone who you know is bad for you, but still wanting to do whatever you can for that person. And that emotional side of this album does have more of those unique lyrics, like on the former of those two songs I just mentioned in the second verse, with the lines about Eric Clapton and John Lennon, and the complicated parasocial relationships people have with problematic celebrities, later echoed in the closing track, albeit without a specific name drop. And Savior Complex is even more haunting, which is a vibe I think a lot of this album aims for. But look, the first big problem I have with this album is that a lot of it just feels too sluggish. And I'll give context because it's not a knock on the songwriting, and I also can get behind mellow albums that don't really pick up the pace at all, which isn't true with this album, we'll get to that. But to properly explain, I think I've got to talk about the production. And while some parts of the album feel a bit unpolished in ways I don't really like, such as how I See You can get a little staticky, or Kyoto buries the vocals in the chorus, I mostly think it sounds really good. In some moments like Graceland 2, it sounds purely beautiful and that's about it. Meanwhile, in songs like Savior Complex and the title track, it fits the haunting vibe so damn well. And there are other details I could talk about, like the way the strings are perfectly placed on the short opening track, or the way the guitars start to pick up the pace on I Know the End. Again, the production is really good, but it's not a production style that I find particularly easy to listen throughout this whole album, considering the mellow instrumentation, where even though it's barely over 40 minutes and there are some more rock-leaning songs, it still feels like it drags a bit. And if I'm not making any sense, it's not the songwriting itself that's the problem, and nor is it the production, nor is it the way those two things go together in individual moments. It's the way those two things go together across the album, where I would have liked a bit more variety, and certain songs like Moonsong or Halloween, both of which I think are pretty good, just feel a bit underwhelming in the context of the album because they don't really move it forward musically. And while I think Phoebe is a good singer who can absolutely knock some of these individual moments out of the park, she doesn't really help with the overall problem I have with the whole album feeling like a bit too much to take in all at once. So I guess what this album needed was some rock passages, right? Well, on paper that's exactly what this album could have used, but then you realize that the rock songs that are on this album are not really that strong. The worst in my opinion being Kyoto, which has such an odd low frequency in the guitars that takes away any punch this could have had in the verses, before the mixing in the chorus makes it even worse. Yeah, I can respect the intent behind the song being about her complicated relationship with her father, but I unfortunately think it's the weakest song here for sounding like another piece of alt-radio clutter that isn't interesting compositionally or melodically, and it really did not need that part at the end of the chorus where she randomly goes, "Woo!" I guess she wants to know who can relate. Okay, it's a bad joke, but then later in the album you get two more rock-leaning songs, both written with her drummer who is also her ex, and written about their breakup, I See You and I Know the End. The latter of which ends the album and suffers from the same problem Billie Eilish's Happier Than Ever does, wherein aiming for such a huge climactic rock ending after a mellow start, it just falls completely flat and doesn't have any impact. And it's a big pet peeve of mine I hear in so many songs like this. And I See You is an okay song, I like it better than Kyoto, but it also just feels kind of bland in its melodies, and it feels like it doesn't really go anywhere. But I don't want to make it sound like I think this album is a total failure or anything, because it's not even close. And that's why I want to highlight what I think are the best songs. Like I said, I think there are some excellent moments here, so I'm going to talk about 3 songs specifically that I think are great, 2 of them to a larger extent, 1 to a smaller extent, that being the title track, about Phoebe Bridgers being a fan of the late Elliott Smith and imagining meeting him, and I think this song has one of the best vocal performances on the album, along with such a gorgeous instrumental right from the opening notes. Sure, I do think the robotic effects on her voice at the start were a bit unnecessary and take away from the vibe a little bit, and I think there was room to go further with this lyrically, make it hit so much harder. I do still think it's a pretty great song that encapsulates her obvious Elliott Smith influence in more ways than one. But there's two songs in this album that I really love a lot, my second favorite being Savior Complex. I talked about the song a little bit already, but man, the imagery of the lyrics paired with such hauntingly gorgeous guitar and strings, and so many subtle details that need to be heard to be believed. Yeah, it's absolutely excellent, especially as her vocals once again shine on this song. And then there's that instrumental bridge with the strings near the end, which just gets me every time. But the song I love the most on this album is the penultimate track, Graceland 2, where she's talking about someone who's likely been in a psych ward and is no longer a danger to herself or to anyone else, and finally feeling alive for the first time in forever, and yet still yearning for more, to reach greater heights. And I absolutely love the Elvis Presley line in the second verse, highlighting the complicated morals surrounding cultural appropriation, and yet still just wanting to feel something more than anything else. And then you get the twist, where you realize that maybe this song is all just fiction, and a prayer for this person in need of help that they'll make it out, hoping to manifest it. But then maybe it's based on reality regarding that person, but hoping that she herself can break free of whatever is holding her back. And that moment of friendship at the end feels like a realization of some of the most important things we often forget. And that's not even mentioning the borderline country instrumentation of this song. Actually, I probably wouldn't even say borderline. And it's absolutely gorgeous, a truly excellent song. And yet I wish I liked the whole album more. I don't know, from the eerie intro all the way to the apocalyptic ending, this album feels like it's aiming bigger, and yet it winds up feeling like a pretty good but not quite transcendent folk album, and it leaves me in a weird place when wondering what her next album is going to be like, assuming she makes another album. I mean, it's been nearly 6 years since this album came out, and I'm not sure when she plans to release new music. But it's hard to know what to expect because, like I said, this album succeeds and fails in interesting ways, where a lot of it works individually, and sometimes it all comes together into phenomenal moments, and even the occasional full song that I really love. But as a whole, it just feels underwhelming. So I guess in terms of a rating, I'll give this a 7 out of 10. Again, I do think it's really good, and I can see why it got a lot of acclaim, but it's not making any decade-end lists for me, except maybe in the overrated category. But even that feels like a long shot, because I've certainly heard much worse albums get as much, if not more acclaim than this one, even in this decade alone. I wonder when we're going to get another album from Phoebe Bridgers, and again, I wonder what it's going to be like, or how much or how little I might end up liking it. But that's it for now, and now we've reached the point in the video where I try and make it look like I'm still reading from a script, even though I'm so clearly going off script. And as always, this is just my personal opinion on this album. But yeah, I'm really glad I was able to finally get a throwback album review done. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while. And I'm actually going to see if, for 2026, I want to see if I can do one throwback review a month. That is not a promise by any means. I am well aware that I just might not be able to do that. And I do want to prioritize reviewing new albums, and that being in terms of individual reviews and mini reviews. But I'm going to see what I can do, and I'm going to see if maybe I can even sort of get caught up in that regard of one per month and maybe do a few more of these before the end of this month. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that. I might get to the end of the year and this might be the only throwback review that I've done. I don't know. But feel free to let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of this video and or what you think of this album. And yeah, like, let me know if this is the sort of thing you want to see. Like, do you want to see more throwback reviews, or would you rather just see more reviews on current music? My main thing is reviewing new music. That's mainly what I do, but I like doing stuff like this too. It can be really fun when I can find the time. And I just got another mini album review video done, so I felt like I could focus on this for today. And yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good album. Like I said, there's a bunch of reasons why I chose this one. I don't quite think it's the amazing masterpiece that a lot of people make it out to be. But yeah, it's definitely a very good album, and I'm curious whatever she's gonna do next. And it's an album that I have been familiar with for a while, but I really tried to let myself really sit with it more recently. But yeah, thank you for watching. I will be back with more videos soon, and I think that's all I gotta say for now.